Hey, well, good morning and welcome to another daily devotional. We are today in First Peter chapter 3. We're going to get right into it because we've got so much to cover today. This is one of the most famous chapters in the Bible for couples and for marriages. This and another passage in Ephesians, which both kind of get at the same thing. But in all, this is not necessarily just talking about marriage. It's kind of like on Sunday mornings whenever, Pastor Virgil or I are preaching, we may talk about being kind, and we'll say, okay, well, be kind to your neighbor, be kind to your friends, be kind to your wife, be kind to this, that section is just how this applies to your marriage. And in the same way, this is a large overarching concept that just touches upon marriage, and it is a concept that will actually touch each and every area of your life. Because I don't know if you knew this or not, but when they wrote the Bible originally, there were no chapters, there were no verses. They were just letters. So we may say, okay, well, there's chapter 3, there's chapter 2, there's chapter 4. It's easy. It made it easier for us to find things, but it's not like when they were writing it, they concluded chapter 2, and then they sent that to their editor, and then they started chapter 3. No, this is just one big long letter. So really, the second half of 2 began this concept that now continues through 3, which is all about humility and submission. Humility and submission, and how those will affect your life forever. In the end of chapter 2, Peter was talking about the way that Jesus had humbled himself, to even die on the cross, how he had talked about Jesus' suffering, all of those things. And it says, even when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. His humility and his willingness to submit to God's will for him. And so in chapter 3, we get into this, and it starts off and it says this: wives in the same way, meaning referring to that last chapter, wives in the same way, just as Jesus did. This isn't saying, wives, you're totally different. Jesus never lived this way. Wives, in the same way as Jesus, submit yourselves to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe in the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. Before we talk about that, let's jump right ahead to where it talks about the husbands. It says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect. So this is a huge, long conversation about husbands and wives, which I would highly recommend, if you have not read the book Love and Respect by Emerson Eggerich, to read that book that dissects this whole chapter. But really what it's getting at is, many times in our human life, we want to do the opposite of what is actually God's will for our lives. And so sometimes when we follow Scripture, it is unpopular to our culture and to our society, or even just to our preference. And what this is saying is, okay, wives, follow your husbands, submit to them. It's not saying they're your master, that you're their slave. It's just saying submit to them, respect them. And in the same way, husbands, respect and submit to your wife, because the overarching theme here for both pride and humility is unity. Because if you have pride and if you're not willing to submit, there will never, ever be unity. Your home will never have unity if your husband and the wife will never, ever learn to submit to each other, because you'll both be pulling in a separate direction all of the time. And it's a mutual submission, because the truth is, wives, you're not always right. And the truth is, husbands, you're not always right. And there's times where there's this mutual submission where both of you, as long as you are both submitted to God, which is the overarching theme through the rest of this, as long as we're submitted to God, we're all in unity. Which then we go on to the rest of the chapter, which goes on to say this: for all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. So now he's kind of doing the 3-point sermon. He said, Jesus lived this way. You should live this way in your marriage. Now you should live this way in your community, kind of thing. He's saying, okay, now in your community, you all need to be like-minded. You all need to be willing to submit to God, which then is being in submission to one another. That unity is everything. And this is something that, if you picked up on this at the beginning, it's talking about so that others could be won over. That the way that we live, both our marriages at the beginning of this and the way that we live in our Christian community, is what the world will look at. It's what the people outside of the walls of our church look at. And when people look at your marriage, they're either going to say, wow, I want to be a Christian because their marriage seems peaceful. I want to be part of their marriage because, wow, they're part of their faith because of their marriage. When they look at our community, they should be able to say, wow, the people that are part of this Christian community, Christian Life Center, that looks amazing. I want to be a part of that because, man, everyone's so kind. Everyone's so generous. Everyone's so like-minded, sympathetic. They love one another. They're compassionate. They're humble. It's one of these things that the way we act this out now becomes, a testimony to our community. And that's what will many times open up the doors for people of faith. So the way that we handle our marriages, the way that we handle our church is, of course, in submission to God, His will for our lives. But at the same time, there comes a point where we have to be different inside of these walls than the people outside there. There comes a point where, we're telling everyone, follow Jesus, the gospel will change your life. But there comes a point where if our life has not been changed, where if our marriage has not been changed, we are becoming liars. Where we're saying, okay, it's time for you need to become a Christian. Why? And I remember this. This is my last story. I'm a minute over, but I'll finish. This is my last story. I remember a youth student many years ago, and I was talking to him about God and all of these things. And he was sitting in my office because we were doing some counseling. He was going through some stuff, and he said, man, I just don't want to become a Christian because the kids in here seem like they're exactly the same as the kids out there. So why would I be a Christian? And at that point, some of the kids in our youth group were dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. There was a lot of things going on. And I thought, he's right. What's the point? And there comes a point where we have to say, no, there is a point. Look at our marriages. Our marriages are better because we follow godly principles. Wow, our community is better because we follow godly principles. And this is where we become doers of the word. So this week, you have to think to yourself, okay, how can I be in unity with my husband or with my wife? How can I be in unity with those around me? How can I put myself aside? How can we mutually submit? So I pray that this week that God will just lead you into becoming more humble, that He will lead you into having a more unity in your marriage and in the community around you. We will see you tomorrow for the next chapter of 1 Peter.